Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 3 of the Fundamentals of Psychedelics lecture series. I'm Grace Lee, the co-chair of Psychedelic Studies Imperial this year, and I am very excited for this week's talk because it is being led by Josh Hulbert, who I was lucky enough to meet on retreat in the Netherlands a number of years ago. Josh started work in the field through drug science, and last week we had our lecture with David Nutt, who founded and led this. And his initial role was in science communications and drug harm reduction. He went on to work in drug harm reduction at a number of festivals across the country, and then worked with the Psychedelic Society, not the Imperial Psychedelic Society, the Psychedelic Society, and their experience retreats, and then set up another experience retreats organization, which he left during the pandemic, and then now is working on a very exciting new non-profit organization providing support and mentorship for people working in the field of psychedelics, with a focus again on harm reduction for people in this field. So today he'll be giving us a lecture on the fundamentals of psilocybin. So please welcome Josh, everybody.
Hello. Hey, thanks, Grace. It's really great to see you again, and it's great to be asked to give this talk on psilocybin, especially now at the peak of the mushroom season. Can I just check that? Yeah, you can hear me? Should I just assume that it's working?
Absolutely, perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So this photo I took a few years ago, around this time of year, and there's probably enough psilocybin in that photo to potentially change someone's life under the right circumstances. And we'll get into what the right circumstances might be in this talk. So the fundamentals of psilocybin, it's really hard to decide what the objective fundamentals are of a chemical that works on subjective experience. So we can all agree on the melting point and chemical formula here that I've snapped off from Wikipedia. And that's what scientists are mostly familiar with doing, with working with things where you feel that there's a separation between the subject and the object, that you can observe something without changing it. And as you will have heard David Nutt talking about last week, that objectivity is critical to like persuading people and building consensus around the properties of these substances. But it's really difficult with psilocybin for many reasons, as we'll see. That photo is of Goodall. She's one of my scientific heroes. I did a master's in primatology, and her object of study was chimpanzees. And you can see there that it was very difficult to maintain the separation between the observer and the observed. And that's true of psilocybin. We change the way that psilocybin behaves with our expectations of psilocybin. And as we'll discuss, psilocybin changes the way that we behave. We're entangled in all these feedback loops. The researchers that conduct the trials on psilocybin for depression, as we'll talk about, are also involved in preparing participants and preparing the expectations of the participants to what the psilocybin will do. So it's very hard to talk about a neutral vision of what psilocybin does, because there really isn't a neutral vision. Psilocybin really manifests its properties in the context that it's used in. So that makes us all active participants in the evolving story of psilocybin. One question that this leads me to is, would you like your psilocybin experts to be users or not? There's this perception that scientific neutrality and objectivity requires some distance. But really, can you understand the properties of psilocybin if you've not had a psilocybin experience? Maybe you'll have opinions on that. So, where's psilocybin from? This image of white fibers in wood chip is the mycelium from which the mushrooms in the first image are sprouting. And that's working away beneath the surface. That is the body of the fungus. The mushrooms are just its fruit. And it's breaking down wood, it's breaking down lignin. And that's a little bit of a metaphor for the early model of psilocybin assisted therapy, which worked on the psycholytic principle. So therapists in the 60s who would get psilocybin legally from a company called Sandoz would give it to their clients who would then take a small dose, not like the current psychedelic research, which is mainly with high doses. And these small doses would break down their ego defenses and maybe their projections and denial. This was working within a psychoanalytic model. And as the framework within which therapists and researchers are working has changed, our model of psilocybin assisted therapy has changed. So these are the two most widespread British magic mushrooms. And to give you an idea of what I mean when I say that the properties really depend on the framework you have, these mushrooms were hidden in plain sight. They weren't known to cause psychedelic experiences as we understand them until 1970, where the first records are of people using liberty caps to have psychedelic experiences. There are early records of poisonings from this species. In 1799, a father went to Green Park in London and collected these mushrooms and fed his family on them. And there's a case report that's published in a medical journal from 1799 in which we can recognize that these people that were intoxicated by liberty caps, but it wasn't anything like the sort of psychedelic experience that is being revealed by the researchers at Imperial and other places. They had an awful time. There was the father thought he was dying. So without the framework in which you understand, you understand what psilocybin can do in a positive way, the properties of psilocybin will not be the therapeutic properties that that the researchers at Imperial and elsewhere are uncovering. Also hidden in plain sight are many women in the story of psychedelic history. This mycologist, Elsie Maud Wakefield, was the discoverer of wavy caps, the mushroom on the right. She discovered them in Kew Gardens where they still grow, but she had no idea of their psychedelic potency. So what's psilocybin? It's a tryptamine, one of several psychedelic tryptamines, and mushrooms synthesize it from tryptophan. Tryptophan is converted to psilocin or psilocybin or serotonin in different mushroom species. And of course, in ourselves, we take the essential amino acid tryptophan, and we make serotonin from it. These tryptamine compounds are widespread in life. You can see here that psilocybin is almost identical to serotonin. It's got that indole structure, and as you know, probably, psilocybin is active at the serotonin receptor, 5-HT2A. But in fact, it's not psilocybin itself which causes the psychedelic experience. When you take it orally, it's broken down to psilocin. It's dephosphorylated, and psilocin on the right there is a specific, especially 5-HT2A, to cause the subjective effects. This is a photo from a London park of wavy caps producing psilocybin and psilocin and many other interesting compounds. But I'd caution against collecting them without really incredible care, because these tryptamines aren't the only compounds made by small brown mushrooms. These two mushrooms, which I have observed growing in London parks near psilocybe cyanescens, contain alpha amanitin, which is also in the death cap and is extremely deadly. So why is psilocybin in there? That's quite a hard question to answer. Lots of these compounds in mushrooms and plants, we assume, are there for defense against being eaten by insects. But the evidence is really quite inconclusive. There's a book called Entangled Life, which I highly recommend, by Merlin Sheldrake. And he discusses the different possibilities. And in some studies, psilocybin slows the eating of insects, which would be useful for the mushroom, because then the mushroom can have longer to distribute its spores and therefore distribute its genes. But some contradictory findings have, some experiments have yielded contradictory findings. So it could be that they want to be eaten, not necessarily by us, and then the animals that have eaten them will distribute their spores. When we're asking the question of what a compound is for in a species, of course, evolution doesn't have a plan. So you could argue that the human cultivation of these species, such as in this picture in a grow shed in the Netherlands, is equally what makes psilocybin adaptive for the mushroom. Two of the main species that produce psilocybin truffles, which are commonly sold in the Netherlands, where mushrooms have been banned, but the truffles are still legal. These species have only been observed once or twice ever in the wild, and they were collected and grown. And so most of the world's population of those species probably lives within these sheds in Holland. In a way, that's their habitat. And for them, psilocybin is adaptive because it's popular among humans. So psilocybin always been popular amongst humans. I mentioned the family in Green Park who poisoned themselves with liberty caps and had a horrible experience because they didn't have the cultural context to make sense of it. But has that always been true? People often assume that our ancestors were munching mushrooms, but surprisingly, there's very little evidence for this. You probably heard of the stoned ape hypothesis from Terence McKenna, which is a speculation that psilocybin was crucial in the evolution of humans and maybe gaining language, gaining conceptual ideas. You can see in this Alex Gray psychedelic painting on the left there, that moment. So that's a speculation with absolutely no evidence, but it's interesting nonetheless. There's lots of artifacts and cave paintings around the world which seem to have representations of psilocybin mushrooms. This beautiful cave painting on the right is from Tassili Najer in Algeria, and is often been described as a mushroom shaman. But this could be confirmation bias. I see mushrooms everywhere. Just a couple of days ago, I saw that tanker driving to. Don't worry, I wasn't the one driving and taking the photo. And you can also see that this shaman looks a lot like the clangers from the BBC children's programme. So if you have the preconception that our ancestors must be using mushrooms, it's very easy to create this narrative, but we haven't yet got evidence for that, except if the ancestors you're talking about are Mesoamerican. And we know that at least from the records from around the time of at the time of the Spanish conquest, mushrooms were being used. There's fantastic descriptions in the books written by missionaries, Spanish missionaries, who described the culture of the Aztecs, and their ceremonies are described with a mixture of horror and fascination by the Catholic missionaries. But they do give us some interesting details about what the mushrooms were used for. They were used in feasts such as Montezuma's coronation. They were used also for healing of physical complaints like fevers and rheumatism. Interestingly, very recently, a paper has been published which shows that users of psychedelics, people who've used psychedelics once or more in their life, seem to have better health, are less likely to be obese. And that wasn't something that would have necessarily been expected. We think of the therapeutic benefits of psilocybin as being on mental health normally. But these compounds could be having anti-inflammatory effects, or they could be promoting better health through other mechanisms like altering health behaviors. So yeah, I will talk a little bit more about the anti-inflammatory effects later. So the indigenous use of magic mushrooms isn't all something that's in the distant past. It's often talked about as if it's you know, ancient primitives used the mushrooms and now covered that. But these mushrooms now, it's a contemporary culture. The Mazatecs in Oaxaca in Mexico, and the most famous user and shaman was Maria Sabina, a curandera, like a healer in her community in Oaxaca, who had a relationship with the mushrooms, which she called the little children, and she shared a mushroom ceremony with a banker called Gordon Wasson. And this is a story I recommend you read the paper that I've read by Anna Lukajtis. Gordon Wasson went to her to find these mushrooms that he'd heard about from these descriptions from Evan Schultz from the previous slide, who'd written about the mushrooms used by the Aztecs. And he sought out the mushroom. He possibly lied to a variety of curanderas and curanderos to persuade them to share a ceremony with him by saying his son was ill, and he had a fantastic experience, and he had enormous respect from Maria Sabina from what you'd read of what he wrote. But then the way he behaved was to publish his history-changing article in Life magazine, in which he put photos of her, having told her he'd only share the photos with his friends, and talked rapturously about this woman and the magic mushrooms, he coined the phrase, that she had. And the result of that was an avalanche of hippies and beatniks who descended on the town, and it had profound consequences for the indigenous users. As in this quote, indigenous communities in Mexico must now choose to either continue their sacred mushroom practices in a context of global prohibition and become criminals, or forgo these practices entirely and rely on Western biomedicine for healing and other sources of spiritual fulfillment. So once the beatniks and hippies turned up, the Mexican authorities started treating this mushroom as like an intoxicant, as a drug, and Maria Sabina's house was burned down. She said that the mushroom stopped speaking to her after that. So that story is told quite frequently of how the West destroyed that indigenous culture of mushroom use, and it's not quite true, or it's often exaggerated, because that culture is a living culture. It's not a primitive culture from the past. It's operating now, and I recommend the book "The Wild Kindness" by Bet Williams, who went to this town, and I've forgotten how to pronounce the name of the town, so I'll mangle that. And she asked, what do white Westerners gain from promoting the idea that they ruined Huatla de Jimenez? Doesn't believing this let us off the hook in terms of nurturing any relationships with the people that might begin to heal a fractured history? Count the innate resiliency of the Mazatec and how they've adapted amidst so much cultural change. So yes, this is a living culture, and the curanderas and curanderos are now Catholic. So this is a culture that changes and develops through contact with other cultures. And of course, that culture is changing our mushroom culture. So psilocybin can be used in so many countless ways. We've just talked about the Mazatec way of using it, which is just fundamentally very, very different from the Western model of psilocybin assisted therapy. Is more divinatory, and you might have a mushroom ceremony to find out where a lost animal is, for example. And also, it's important in that context for the curandera, curandero or curandera, to also take the mushroom too. So there's so many frameworks in which psilocybin can have its effects. In this Western context, one of the reasons that it can have so many different models is that it's remarkably non-toxic. So therapeutic index is very large. So the difference between a dose which has effects and a dose which would cause toxic effects, that means that there's just a huge quantitative difference between the low dose effect and the high dose effect. So you can see here that psilocybin is used by different people across 3 orders of magnitude. People are using 1 milligram doses of psilocybin, and they're using 300 plus milligram doses of psilocybin in different ways. Starting with microdosing there on the left. Microdosing is extremely hyped, and it's not certain that the hype is going to be supported by the evidence. It's definitely running ahead of the evidence at the moment. So the truth could be anywhere between this being a fantastic tool that could help many people to lead better lives, or it could be nothing but a placebo. Both of those options I think, remain possible. So it has been studied in a few different ways, but most of these studies have been through online surveys, which, as you know, introduces lots of sorts of bias. And this recent study that I'm referencing here um, did something interesting in that it asked people before they'd microdosed what their expectations were. And they found that the people with the highest expectations that it was going to radically improve their mood or help them work productively or to be more emotionally resilient, those were the people who did end up getting those effects. Now that could mean a lot of things, but one possibility is that this is a hint that it's the placebo effect that is making microdosing powerful. So, by analogy, there's many people who use religious relics to like touch a religious relic, thinking that that will um, improve their well-being, to get the blessings of the saints, and that works because of a huge belief system that's attached to it. And it seems that microdosing, I think, piggybacks on this growing belief system around the wonders of psilocybin, which comes from many sources, including the scientific research. So lots of the things that people report as benefits of psilocybin microdosing are kind of like um, the same sort of effects that are being reported widely in the media from the trials of psilocybin for mental health or well-being. So it seems perhaps that the beliefs that people form about what psilocybin is like could be influencing the effects that they get when they're microdosing. Now, you might say that that makes microdosing worthless if it proves to be only placebo. Other people would say that placebo is better than nothing and pretty good in some situations. There's lots of people who feel that microdosing has materially improved their life. So I'm not going to go too deeply into the pharmacology because I think most of you have heard the lecture that Manesh gave a couple of weeks ago, or could revisit it. But to just run through a couple of things. So psilocybin is the drug that is administered in these trials and is the main component in many of these mushrooms. But when you take it, it's phosphorylated to psilocin, and psilocybin itself is not thought to be contributing very much to the effects. It's psilocin that's the real deal, and that's an agonist of the 5-HT2A receptor, one of like many serotonin receptors we have all over the body. That receptor's in your gut as well. It's in all your cells, and some of those anti-inflammatory effects that perhaps Mazatec curanderas are using psilocybin for could be mediated by that. Um, it's it's the best studied psychedelic, and that's not an accident. It seems very suited for a lot of these therapeutic roles, and one reason for that is that its duration is that sweet spot therapy. LSD is a longer experience. There's some psychedelic which last even longer than LSD, and DMT lasts just a few minutes. DMT, by the way, is very closely related to psilocybin. Sorry, psilocin, I should say, which psilocin is 4-hydroxy DMT, and so they're very close analogs, and just that small difference uh, creates the difference in duration. Another property is that you can't keep tripping if you keep dosing. it wears off very fast, the ability to trip multiple times in a row. You simply can't do that. After tripping, you have to wait a week or so to trip again, and that's called tachyphylaxis. I've mentioned the therapeutic index. Okay, so on to psychedelic therapy, and Imperial, of course, is pioneering this. I'm going to quote this paper by Roseman et al. Psychedelic therapy may be more appropriately thought of as a distinct form of drug-assisted psychotherapy than as a pure pharmacotherapy. Psychedelic therapy involves a small high-dose psychedelic dosing sessions that are intended to facilitate a profound, potentially transformative psychological experience. Now, this means that it's really hard to talk about this being the property of the molecule psilocybin, because it's hard to disentangle what the molecule is doing and what people like Ros Watts there in that picture are doing. And it's hard not just to collect the evidence that could disentangle those two things, but even conceptually, like those things are, they are a whole. You cannot divide them. But of course, opinions really differ on whether this effect of psychedelic therapy, the profound effects it has, is like 90% an effect of a chemical in the brain, or if it's 90% the effect of like therapy, which is just nudged along or lubricated by a molecule. So psychedelic therapy, you'll probably be aware, was being done back in the 60s legally, and then it has continued underground since at a very low level. But now we're in this revolutionary time when it's being studied again, and we're getting an evidence base starting to build up. And we've got solid evidence now from the clinical trials from Imperial that psychedelic therapy is fantastic for depression, um, but it might be quite arbitrary that like depression was chosen, that was studied first, but it's not necessarily intrinsically antidepressant. It's not even necessarily intrinsically better for helping with people with diagnosed disorders versus helping any one of us. So there is some hints of the sort of things that it could be good for versus not so good for. So the models that are being built up to explain how psychedelic therapy works can be thought of as it's eating fixed patterns. It's relaxing fixed patterns that people carry around with them. So addiction is an example of a fixed behavioral pattern that someone can feel like they can't get from, and they might have a particular fixed idea of themselves as an addict. People who are depressed might have ruminating thoughts churning around their heads of the exact sort of person that they are and their chances of getting better, which keep them trapped and stuck. So psychedelic therapy seems really good for the sort of problems that people have, which in stuckness. It seems to lift people out of that stuckness, which means that it might not be so good for disorders which are more defined by instability rather than overstability. So people with schizophrenia might not be helped by a substance which is very disruptive to the way you think about the world. To add disruption on top of disruption might not help. But I don't have much confidence in asserting that, because it's still very early days, and it might be that there are ways that people with personality disorders or bipolar disorder, who are currently excluded from research and excluded from retreats, such as those that I was involved in, it might be that there are ways that those people can benefit from psilocybin too, because of its inherent flexibility, because of how much the model in which it is used determines its outcomes. Um, I should have mentioned more that ski track metaphor. So um, that metaphor is that our thoughts, uh, the fixed thoughts that we carry around with us, a little bit like the trenches and snow that skis make, that you can get kind of stuck in those ruts, those tracks. And psychedelics, and psilocybin is the most studied one, is like the snowplow that smooths that out and allows people to um, move away from those fixed patterns that they've held. So Robin Carhart Harris has tried to put this all together in a fantastic model called the Rebus model, relaxed belief under psychedelics. This is like um, uh, this is explained in Manesh's lecture, so I'm not going to go over it too much. But just to say that, as Robin points out, many of the characteristics um, of psilocybin, including the visual hallucinations, which I've not even touched on, can be thought of as relating to this same model of relaxed top-down processes, allowing more more freedom and chaos, and different parts of the brain to talk to each other in ways that they otherwise wouldn't. So when we see things, if you think of clothes over the back of your chair in a dark room, you might think of those clothes are like a person standing there. You probably had that experience, and that's because your brain's made a prediction based on previous knowledge. So it feels like you're perceiving something from the bottom up. You're using your senses to perceive something, like a man standing in your room. But actually, it's a pre-existing model that's in your head, um, a pre-existing memory of what people look like that has been imposed over your perception of the world. So um, that experience of being wrong about what an object is something that you can experience under psilocybin, because those predictive models that uh, make a guess, a prediction, what it is we're seeing or what something means, are loosened. So we're not so reliant on those same predictions that we always carry around with us, our traumas from the past, all these things which impose themselves on our way of seeing the world. So if you haven't tried psychedelics, I must say that this picture is much more hideous than a genuine psychedelic experience. But it gives the impression, it shows you how once you uh, loosen the expectation that this is an all, your mind uh, can native and interpret the shapes that it sees, the stimuli that are coming in, all sorts of novel ways. So what I've talked about so far, mostly based on the idea that psilocybin is working psychologically through your changing your experience. But there are some scientists who think that we're really neglecting the pharmacological effects that happen completely independently of those subjective effects. This is a current controversy. Um, there's emerging research that shows quite convincingly in rodents that psychedelics, including psilocybin, radically increase plasticity. So, uh, um, so you can return the brain to a state where it can be molded or changed more like a child's brain, almost like an earlier developmental stage, which of course can help explain some of the therapeutic benefits if you make someone's brain physically more moldable, more you open a window for the brain to rewire in different ways, that could cause positive outcomes in someone with depression, for example. But this is something that's dividing psychedelic researchers, because there's lots of subjective experience is, but it goes deeper than that. I think that there's something ideological that it's almost painful to think that psilocybin could work even if you don't have this transformative lived experience. Um, People are very strongly attached to that idea, and I'm one of those people. So it would, though, have some undeniable benefits if at least some of the therapeutic potential of psilocybin could be offered to people who couldn't necessarily take uh, psilocybin itself. So, if you made an analog of psilocybin which wasn't psychoactive, which didn't cause that experience, perhaps someone with schizophrenia or some reason for not being able to access uh, typical psychedelic therapy, they could maybe benefit from at least some of the life-changing effects that come when your brain becomes more plastic temporarily. So this is the other side, the experiential side, seeing psychedelic therapy as something dependent on your experience. So the question is psilocybin more like an SSRI, something that's working with a very pharmacological mechanism, or is it more like an experience in your life, like being on the TV program Queer Eye? In that program, people who have various struggles in their life have an experience of a few days, which allows them to experience themselves differently. And which of these is a better metaphor for psychedelic therapy? And I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but you can make a very strong argument that being helped by Queer Eye is closer analogy to psilocybin than SSRIs. Many of the things that seem to be important in the healing potential of psychedelics, for example, a sense um, of meaning, of interconnection, like oceanic boundlessness, of feeling absorbed into the universe. Many of those things are better understood as people going through a moment, a profound moment of experience. Um, Dr. Adam Ghazali has set up um, a new institute called Neuroscape, where Robin, I think, is the director, Robin Carhart Harris, and he uses computer games as a way of helping people with ADHD. So a computer game experience, and maybe psychedelics are a little bit more like that than like an SSRI. So as it, that what I've just said about it being less like an SSRI might come to a surprise, come as a surprise to people who've been reading about these findings in the news, because sometimes it's presented as if psilocybin is a new SSRI, and there's a difficult position that psychedelic researchers find themselves in having to put psilocybin through the same kind of rigorous um, placebo-controlled trials alongside SSRIs like escitalopram, and making these comparisons where really maybe something is lost in the comparison. Um, this trial, which happened quite recently, comparing escitalopram to psilocybin, found that um, their their main uh, their main measure of effectiveness, psilocybin was very slightly better, as you can see in the top line of this this chart, the QIDS line, there wasn't really a significant difference on that measure, which slightly represented how fantastic psilocybin was in this trial. If you look at the plot on the right, psilocybin was better at every single measure that they measured, but the main measure that they um, they said that they would look at was the QIS, which is the Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptoms, or something like that. And that might not be the best lens. For example, these are some of the items. I think suicidal death several times a week for several minutes. That can be definitely a sign of depression. But also, if you've gone through a very healing psychedelic experience, it can stop you being avoidant of profound, meaningful thoughts, such as thinking about death. So it's possible that someone could have a beautiful and healing experience, and still score quite badly on the QIDS. At the bottom there, I find I have interest in only one or two of my formerly pursued activities. That's exactly what you would expect someone to say if they were depressed, but also it's what someone would say if they have had a potentially transformational experience which has made them go a different path in life, maybe give up some of their old hobbies and take on new hobbies. So when you see some of this research, bear in mind that we may be asking psilocybin to perform in a competition that doesn't necessarily show its to its highest strengths. Um, Another problem or limitation of the model that we're currently testing psilocybin is that medicines are generally for people who are ill. If you think of insulin, insulin corrects a specific disorder that a diabetic has and enables them to return to health. Psilocybin isn't so much like that, in that lots of the things it does work very well in all the people it has been tested on healthy normals, as we're called in the literature. Sorry, I shouldn't assume, as some of us are called. So psilocybin seems to have benefits which aren't restricted to correcting a deficit that is in some people with a particular disorder. It doesn't seem that that's really part of its mechanism. Given that, I know some of you are medical students. I wonder how you feel about the prospect of prescribing psilocybin or sending people to get psilocybin therapy, knowing that were you to do the same thing, or if someone else was to do the same thing without a diagnosis, that could still put them in prison. It's going to be a messy process navigating this all. So, as you know, I have been involved in non-clinical approaches, and I don't want this to come across as a criticism of clinical approaches. I'm a huge fan of the research that's been doing. I didn't talk enough about, running out of time, but I didn't talk enough about the systems of therapy that have been developed by people like Watts to work with people going through psilocybin experiences. But there are other approaches. So commercial retreats are one of them. I've left the organization I was working with. They have many limitations. They do a lot of good work. They have many limitations. They are totally inaccessible to most people because they cost £1,000 or more. There's, of course, community-oriented use. You can use psilocybin with a community of like-minded people. This is happening underground around the world. But, of course, that's not an approach that's going to suit everybody. Personal use, of course, is the most common way of using psilocybin at the moment as like for many reasons, whether it's recreational or for personal development. And there's many advantages of psilocybin, like the communitas, the sense of bonding that has been demonstrated within groups using psilocybin that you can't access if you are using it alone. And also, there's lots of safety concerns. Um, so all of these have costs and benefits. Uh, I know I'm very much running out of time, um, but if you have ideas of what could be next, what could evolve in future, I would love to hear about them. And this doesn't need to necessarily be in opposition to therapeutic models. This could be something that could be integrated into healthcare systems. Doctors can do social prescribing. That's when you prescribe someone to join their community choir, for example. So it might be that with that research demonstrates that psilocybin therapy can be conducted outside of a clinical model. An analogy would be to birth, where there's a range of options. You can give birth in a hospital, which is right for many people and reduces the risk for people with complex needs. But you can also give birth at home, and for people who maybe it's not their first birth and it's an uncomplicated pregnancy, giving birth at home can be just as low risk as giving birth in hospital. Um, I'm going to have to race through this, but we've talked a lot about, sorry, I've talked a lot about individual benefits of psilocybin, but there's ways that it's possible that psilocybin could have more wide-reaching, rippling out effects. One of the effects of psilocybin um, is that it seems to change people's relationship to nature. Now, like I've discussed, it's hard to say if this is intrinsic to psilocybin itself or in the culture that most people are using it in, which might be quite a hippie culture or might come with particular personality traits. So it's hard to know from some of this survey work what direction the causation is, but it's definitely clear that after using psilocybin, that people's nature relatedness, their sense of being connected to nature increases, which isn't surprising given the subjective experience of blending in with nature and becoming part of nature. That's often called oceanic boundlessness. Um, you might have seen in the news, William Shatner just went to space on Jeff Bezos's phallic rocket. And I would really recommend watching the video of how he reacted when he came down. He had on that rocket a mystical experience, and it's a very important reminder that the effects that we're talking about here are not um, are not restricted to psilocybin. Psilocybin seems to open the door to people having experiences that our brains are naturally capable of and are naturally part of our lives. Um, William Shatner had this mystical experience when he was in space, which he's not the first. There has been research into astronauts. All these quotes come from this paper by Vosky, and it sounds almost identical to the effects of psilocybin reported in by users of psilocybin and people who've been administered it in clinical trials and research. This overview effect, this experience of seeing everything, being transformed by awe. But you might have some skepticism about the overview effect. Is it enough for people? When I was working in the retreats, sometimes we would have people fly from America to the Netherlands, emitting vast amounts of carbon dioxide, in order to have an experience which connected them to nature and made them feel that they should change their nature behaviors, which is, you know, questionable. So we can't all go to space to have psychedelic experiences. We can't all go to retreats, but perhaps there's other models that people can get this overview effect, which could help with the crisis, the planetary crisis we find ourselves in. So, yeah, I want to wind up on a cautious note that it's so common to hear hype and raving, and I've given you quite a lot of hype and raving about psilocybin tonight, which is what I genuinely feel. But I also have fears and questions um, about maybe some of these things won't work out like we would like them to, and of course we can all participate in trying to manifest the future for psilocybin that we'd most like to see, because we should be asking ourselves, are the effects of psilocybin inherently good, or could they be misused? This famous quote from Terence McKenna: psychedelics are illegal not because of a loving government protecting you, but because they dissolve opinion structures, and that can sound really good, and we need, the COP coming up, we really need to radically change the opinion and lifestyle of a vast amount of people globally. At the same time, we know that having divergent opinions and stopping believing culturally normative ideas spiral out of control a little. And this is an example. The QAnon shaman, one of the people who raided the Capitol, who is a big fan of psychedelics. So we should hesitate from assuming that psychedelics are inherently going to fix everything. We need, if we want psychedelics to be useful for both individuals and the world, maybe we need to make that happen. Policy. Of course, David's covered this. I'm not going to go too deep into it. But just to say that there's just like endless options, and sometimes I think we're limited and stifled in the conversations we have about drug policy. So I just really encourage everyone to vision their utopias of how they would like to see psilocybin incorporated to Western culture in a more coherent way. It's coming, so we have to decide how we would like that to look. I'd like to mention psychedelic exceptionalism. I know there's so much enthusiasm about psychedelics, especially amongst demographics such as my own, of quite middle class white people who don't necessarily get stopped by the police on the street for drugs all the time, that kind of thing. And as psychedelic exceptionalism is the belief that psychedelics are different and special, and that we should focus on them entirely, and not really care about drug policy reform in other ways. And that can be it's just extremely toxic. So if you're interested in advocating for policy reform and a future where these substances can be a positive influence in people's lives, please endeavour to not leave people behind, not to try and climb into legitimacy. Psychedelics are moving into legitimacy, and it's very easy to try and climb into legitimacy at the expense of other people, by drawing a contrast between your exceptional good psychedelic use versus their dirty, like, cannabis use or cocaine use. So yeah, let's go on to some questions. What is legitimate use? Who are legitimate users? I wonder if any of these spark any questions for you. I'll turn over to you.
Thank you so much, Josh. I think, yeah, you raised some really important points, particularly noting the high therapeutic index of psilocybin, and how actually, despite kind of mainstream media hysteria, it does have a very wide safety margin.
Well, safety in one.
Yeah, Yes, yes, of course, of course, of course. Important to have a safe container for the use, for that to be the case, definitely. And again, highlighting this, thank you. I think that feature of psilocybin for me, in terms of the kind of like looking ahead to the future use of it and integrating that with the kind of being a bit more eco-friendly in the way that we prescribe medicines as doctors, seeing how actually could we prescribe people to use psilocybin in the mushroom form rather than this kind of chemically intensive synthesized way, and could that reduce environmental harm in that way? And would that be a kind of more conscious and considerate way of using psychedelics? What do you think?
Such a fascinating question. Well, firstly, Maria Sabina, after she gave Wasson samples to take back, he took those samples to Albert Hoffman, who synthesized psilocybin for the first time. And then the synthesized psilocybin made the return journey to Maria Sabina, who was asked to sample it. And she tried that synthesized psilocybin and thought that the spirit of the little children was speaking to her through, so perhaps synthesized psilocybin is so bad. But because of the placebo effect, the positive side of the placebo effect, which give some effects of microdosing, and also all the positive effects which enhance setting as a whole, I personally believe that taking mushrooms, especially fresh, especially if you pick them yourself, can really set people a beautiful experience, more than experience of swallowing some gelatin capsules. Yeah. So potentially, it's quite a mountain to climb, because goods manufacturing practice dictates that prescribed drugs have to, be viable and identical, even though it would be possible to show that it really doesn't matter, because the precise exact dose won't make a huge difference to the therapeutic potential. I think that like mushrooms, even though that they might have slight differences, because so much are determined by other factors, it would be as effective.
And I suppose realizing that for you and for me, that process of going out harvesting mushrooms yourself would feel more therapeutic. But there are plenty of people for whom actually, for them, the kind of extra added process of receiving a pill in a capsule, for them, that's what says medicine to them. And so I guess it's just about kind of having the options available to people, whether they would want to have the mushroom form or whether they would want to have the capsule form.
Exactly. There's many people who came to our retreats who I think would have preferred to have the option to go to a clinic with white sheets and white coats, and that would make them feel safer. And there's many people who might take it in a therapeutic. I've stereotyped the therapeutic context wrongly there, because of course the research might make it as cozy as they can. But still, many people in that context might prefer to be doing it in a woodland. So it would be lovely if it was possible to have different options springing up, and doctors given the potential to prescribe different options.
Yeah, no, definitely. Especially as you rose the point as well of kind of looking at psilocybin in that one context and not necessarily being able to kind of see all of its strengths through that one lens. But then even through that lens, it was still able to kind of be seen as just as effective as escitalopram, if not very slightly more so, but
But
on the kids in
Robin
school.
Robin wrote a blog where his frustration came across a little, that it couldn't show how great it was through that study because their main outcome measure was the UIDS. Yeah, I can empathize with him.
And then, as one thing that I've considered a lot in the context of psilocybin, because I'm also doing some research with the medical cannabis research group at Imperial, and this idea of the entourage effect, which with cannabis, for people who haven't heard about it or don't know what it is, this idea that the other cannabis compounds act synergistically, and that whole plant extracts have been seen to be more effective than just the kind of THC or CBD isolates, and whether that could be the case with kind of whole mushroom versus psilocybin, and how possible it would be to kind of do those studies and see that, and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and like I'm really looking forward to that research. Yeah, there are a bunch of other compounds. There's one called Biologist that we assume just works like becomes psilocin or works like psilocin, and there's others. It might be the case that they're altering the effect, but one thing that probably does more is the speed at which the psilocybin is phosphorylated to psilocin. So in a mushroom, some of the depending on the species, some of the psilocybin is already psilocin. So maybe it would change the very crucial first onset of the experience, the speed of it. Some users mix lemon juice with their mushrooms to convert it all to psilocin to make them work as fast as possible. It might be that the therapeutic effects are greater or the risk lower if you do the opposite, and you want to create a slow release preparation where it's all psilocybin. So yeah, it does make a difference, I suppose. The like what different compounds the mushrooms contain, but it might be possible to replicate that just by making the capsules of psilocybin slow release or fast release.
And can you tell us a little bit more about this non-profit organization that you established?
Yeah. So I suppose though I have loved the work I've done with the retreats, I have some of those frustrations about accessibility because of the money it costs, and also these questions of who are the gatekeepers to psychedelic experience. And there's this irony that so many people working in this space themselves explored psilocybin independently or with friends, and went on their own path, and yet they are advocating a model where you have to do things under quite professional supervision. So whether or not you would like tight professional supervision, there's a whole spectrum of users who could benefit from some support and mentorship to be able to have a Zoom call, maybe with someone to talk about what path would suit them, and maybe they would be best served by a retreat, or maybe they already intend to use outside of that supportive context and want to make the best of that situation. So there's a harm reduction argument for helping someone, even if their model of use isn't something that would suit you and is not the most optimal. So it's the idea of the organisation is to provide support both through experts and through peer-to-peer support for people, whatever their path with psilocybin. So it can be a more long, supported relationship, cautious, evolving over time, um, rather than these like one shots. Go and do a retreat. Go and do an ayahuasca retreat. There's emerging evidence that these processes where you incorporate other forms of self-development and take it slow, could be more effective. And it will be supported by donations, so people will pay what they can. And if people support the idea that they can donate so that other people can be supported on their psychedelic journeys. If people have benefited from psychedelics themselves, they might want to help other people get the sort of help that they weren't lucky enough to get when they were, that they wish that could have existed when they started in psychedelics. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, the accessibility issue is very key. I mean, the psychedelic experience retreats over kind of tripled in price since the time
Yeah.
that we met. So yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic initiative. I'm very excited to see what comes from it, and I'm sure that we get quite a few emails and questions about these things. So perhaps we can be pointing people in your direction, in the
Yes,
forest, the direction of the forest.
please. I welcome anyone who wants to ask. Contact the forest. Find the website, theforestcommunity.org. Send me a message. And if you're interested in safe mushroom foraging, because I mentioned it's the time of year, and I know that there's serious risks of people getting the wrong thing.
Yeah.
I made a YouTube video that you can find through the website too, which gives guidance for correctly identifying liberty cats. And that was
We'll definitely include the links to all the papers that you referenced and to that in the info of the YouTube video, for sure. Thank you so much, Josh. We'll wrap
Thanks.
it up there.
That's been a pleasure.